Welcome to Mormonland, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other Mormon faiths. I'm religion reporter Tamara Kimsley. I'm joined by Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hey, Dave.
Hi, Tamara.
Before we start, a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com/Mormonland. That is patreon.com/Mormonland and click on Become a Member. There you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormonland newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. Now for today's episode. Dan McClellan was working full-time as a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2023 when he quit his post of 10 years to go all in as a podcaster and social media influencer. Rather than peddling parenting or workout hacks, Dan, who has a doctorate in theology and religion, has attracted more than 1 million followers with his Bible hot takes. Through it all, the author of the book, The Bible Says So, due out in April, is particularly interested in rooting out misconceptions about what the text teaches. He joins us today to help us better understand the evolution of the story of the Nativity and how the rendition enacted in countless Christian households this season. Scenes dominated by toddlers donning bathrobes and lightsabers doubling as shepherd's hooks. Strays, perhaps, from the descriptions found in the Gospels. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So first question, how do the Gospels differ in their story of Jesus' birth, which is principally told, I know, in Luke?
Yeah, there are actually only two Gospels that talk about Jesus' birth. That is Matthew and Luke, which are probably the second and probably the fourth Gospels composed. So Luke was probably composed somewhere around, actually, I think probably in the 2nd century CE, so maybe around 110, maybe between maybe 80 CE, 110 CE, somewhere around there. Matthew probably between 70 and 80 CE. And each of them have near the beginning this nativity story, this story of Jesus' birth. And both of them attribute this to some kind of miraculous series of events, but the two stories are not harmonious. They are very different stories about Jesus' birth. And the first thing to say is that these are probably secondary developments. As the story of Jesus is spreading over the course of decades, at some point there was probably a question raised about where Jesus came from, because Mark begins at Jesus' baptism. Paul never says a word about where or how Jesus was born. The relevant part of Jesus' life begins when his ministry begins. And then people started asking questions about the before times. And it was probably related to a concern that the Messiah come from Bethlehem, because we do have things in the Hebrew Bible that suggest this messianic Savior who's expected to show up would come from Bethlehem. And so all of a sudden we have two Gospels that say, oh yeah, it turns out he came from Bethlehem, which is rather convenient. It's Jesus of Nazareth. Any other time that Jesus' hometown is mentioned. And so many historical critical scholars today, scholars who work on trying to reconstruct who the historical Jesus might have been, would probably say that it's more likely than not Jesus was born in Nazareth. There's nothing we would expect out of the ordinary about his life, and if somebody's from a certain town, that's usually where they were born. But we have in Matthew this story of the mother and father of Jesus being in Bethlehem. Jesus is born. They flee to Egypt to hide out from Herod, who has been tipped off by the Magi that the King of the Jews, the Messiah, is going to be born in Bethlehem. So they flee to Egypt, wait until Herod's dead, and then they come back, and it seems like they want to go back to Bethlehem. But Joseph is warned in a dream. Well, basically, Herod Archelaus one of Herod's sons, has taken over rule of that area. And so the idea is, you got to go to the north, go into the Galilee. And they just kind of make their way and settle in Nazareth. Just kind of incidentally, they end up in Nazareth. And this part of the story is probably just saying, he was actually born in Bethlehem, but here's how he gets to Nazareth. And this is why everybody knows him as Jesus of Nazareth. And there's the story of of Herod sending out these death squads to go kill all the children born within the last 2 years based on when the star showed up and all this kind of stuff, suggesting that Jesus was probably almost 2 by the time Herod did this, which would mean this is at least 2 years before Herod's death in 4 BCE. So Jesus may have been born around 6 BCE. If Matthew is accurate, and Matthew's probably not accurate. But that's one telling of how this all happens. And then we get to Luke, and Luke's nativity, many scholars think is maybe a secondary addition to the Gospel of Luke itself. In other words, the Gospel of Luke was in circulation because chapter 3 begins how we would expect a gospel to begin. It happened in this year of this Caesar and in this part of the world and under the governorship of this person, and that's how we would expect a gospel to begin. But that's chapter 3 in Luke. So some scholars think that chapters 1 and 2, apart from the little introductory verses at the very beginning, were actually added later. And the Greek is very different in Luke 1 and 2. None of the miraculous events of the Nativity are ever mentioned again in the entire Gospel of Luke. So that may be a secondary addition, but Luke has them living in Nazareth, and he's got to get them down to Bethlehem. And so he says there was this census. Caesar decided the whole world was going to be taxed. They had to go to their ancestral hometown in order to register for this tax. So they've got to go from Nazareth all the way down to Bethlehem. And this is phenomenally problematic from a historical point of view, because Luke explicitly says this is all going on during the days of Herod. But we know when Quirinius, who is mentioned in the text, conducted a census of Judea. That was in 6 BCE. 6 CE. That was a full 10 years after Herod died. That other Herod Archelaus, he was such a moron that Rome just deposed him, was like, get out of here, we're going to do it ourselves. And then they were like, well, we need to know who's living here. Let's conduct a census, and then we can know how to govern this region ourselves. So they had Quirinius in Syria. They said, hey, man, go down to Judea, do a census. So that's when that happened. That was a full 10 years after Herod was dead. Luke says this is happening during the days of Herod. So already we are off the historical charts. There's no reason that they would have anybody go to their ancestral hometown for a census. There are a bunch of problems with that. I think the biggest one is that would entirely nuke the economy. It's like, all right, taking off for about a month. See you guys.
Everybody move, go someplace else, close up your shop, do this.
Would it cause inflation though?
And the other problem is it would give them useless information, because you'd have all of a sudden the population centers just shift. And they get all this information about big cities, and it would be entirely inaccurate. So that didn't happen. There are no data that support the notion that happened. That is Luke's literary MacGuffin for getting Jesus, or at least Mary, down to Bethlehem. And then after they're done, there's no Herod. There's no murder of children under 2. They stay until they've fulfilled their days of purification, and the text says, so they went back to Nazareth. Huh. So we got 2 entirely different stories.
Can I just say that as a pregnant woman, it actually makes me really relieved to think that Mary wasn't riding a donkey from Nazareth to Bethlehem.
Well,
I find great comfort in this.
Interestingly enough, the tradition of Mary riding a donkey actually comes from a non-canonical gospel. Because she would not have ridden a donkey. But we have what's called the Proto-Evangelium of James, or the Proto-Gospel of James, also known as the Infancy Gospel of James, which is probably composed around the middle of the 2nd century CE, that tells the story that explicitly has Mary riding a donkey down to Bethlehem. And so there are a bunch of
movie. Yeah, I'm sorry, Dan. The new movie Mary. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen the images from it.
Yeah, it shows her and Joseph in a horse and carriage. Essentially, they're in a wagon, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Still migrating to Bethlehem, of course.
Right.
But, yes.
So there are a lot of features of the story as we know it, and primarily because they've been passed down through the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, because that was most directly influenced by the infancy gospel of James. A lot of the ways we think about this happening come from that story. So the notion that Mary rode a donkey, that's from that. The notion that Jesus was born in a cave, that's more Orthodox Catholic than it is Protestant. But that's from the infancy gospel of James. The notion that Mary remained a virgin even after giving birth to Jesus is from the proto-gospel of James. There are midwives who show up, and they're late. They don't experience the actual event, but one of the midwives goes to examine things and finds that something that is mythologically indicates virginity is still intact. And but because she's in doubt, her hand starts burning, and she has to pray to God to get him to put it out. But this is a way that an authorized, this is a person who would know what they're talking about, confirms her perpetual virginity. So that tradition comes from the proto-gospel of James.
So Dan, the thinking is that, just quickly, that Jesus was born in Nazareth, more than likely.
I think if we had to pick a spot, I would say the likelihood is greater that he was born in Nazareth than Bethlehem.
What's the distance between Bethlehem and Nazareth? I mean, I should know that, but I don't.
It's a few days. Bethlehem is about 6-ish miles south of Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Nazareth is way up, kind of in the middle toward the north end of the Jezreel Valley. So it's a little west and a little south of the Sea of Galilee. It would have been a couple days' journey. Okay. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. So
yeah. Let's talk about some of the other traditions. Well, okay. Jesus born in a stable. I've seen a couple things you've had on this, of course. Was Jesus born? Is that accurate? And who else might have been present at his birth?
So if we take either of these narratives as historical, and likely neither of them are historical. Likely both of them are entirely literary creations. These are people decades later going, how can we tell a cool story about Jesus being born? He's got to be in Bethlehem, but then we got to get him back to Nazareth. And that's how you get these two different stories. But in Luke, it says there's no room in the inn. That's the way we've always understood this. And so we picture Mary and Joseph. It's windy, maybe it's snowing, and she's close to tears, and they've got to go out and just find any kind of shelter. And they find a stable, and they empty out a feeding trough and that's not what happens at all. Because the word that is translated in Luke is katalima in Greek. And this is used later in Luke to talk about the Last Supper. They went and prepared the katalima. This is the room, not a building. It's the place where you eat. It's the guest room. It's usually the place where you slept. In this time period, the prototypical house was what archaeologists recall, or what archaeologists call a 4-room house, where on the bottom floor, which is enclosed by some kind of wall, that is where you stored stuff. That's where the animals were kept. That's where you prepared things. But you normally had some kind of ladder up to a second floor, which was where you slept, where you would eat. That is probably what's being referred to as the katalima in Luke. And then you would also have a roof. Half of the house would probably be open to the outside air. The second and floor and the roof would be enclosed, and people would also go up onto the roof. That was intended to be occupied as well. And so when it says there's no room in the katalima, it probably means the sleeping quarters or the dining room or the guest room was full, and so they just had to go downstairs into the storage area where food is prepared, where the animals are kept, for her to give birth. And, this raises a bunch of other questions. What a bunch of jerks to be like, sorry, we're not moving. And and the other question is, well, maybe they were like, hey, there's more, we have more access to stuff down here. There's a bit more privacy down here. Like, there are a bunch of different ways to think about why that would have been the case. But again, it's a literary creation. So it's not historical. And this is one of the big problems with the way people try to reason their way through how they interpret a text, is they always imagine what this would be like in real life. And then they come up with what I think are not accurate conclusions, because these are not things that happened in real life. These are things that people thought up and wrote down. But the feeding trough, the manger, is just a feeding trough that would have been downstairs in the house. So she was probably staying with family. If we're taking this as historical, almost certainly there would have been midwives present. That was one of the most common kind of medical professionals of the day, because pregnancies and births were pretty risky events at that time period. So there would have been other people present. There, obviously, if the room is full of people, then a lot of the family would have been there. And so it's not quite as dire a circumstance as we sometimes like to portray, if we think of it as historical.
What about the Magi? How do they fit in? What's the sort of, how have we adapted their roles, and what do you think their purpose plays in the story as originally told?
So with the Magi, we're going back to Matthew. We have left Luke, and this story predates Luke, perhaps by multiple decades. But Magi is a Greek term that seems to refer to not wise men, but probably astrologers / priests from the Iranian region, probably Zoroastrian. And these were kind of your prototypical, these were the people who spent the most time thinking about the natural world and looking to the skies, and they were your diviners, they were your astrologers from that time and place. And so they come to Herod, and this is where they're kind of mocking Herod, because they come to Herod and they say, "We saw the sign in the stars. Where's the Messiah, the King of the Jews, who's supposed to be born?" And Herod's like, "The what now?" And so part of this is saying the Herod, who held himself up as the King of the Jews, they probably would have denigrated him as only half Jewish anyway. But he's totally unaware that these messianic signs are painted on the fabric of the universe. But these non-Jewish people, whose profession is to observe the stars, can see what's going on. So it's saying he's an idiot. And it's also suggesting that Jesus' birth is so important, so pivotal a moment in human history, in the history of the universe, that it is inscribed upon just the fabric of the skies, so much so that people who aren't even Jewish are aware that this is happening. And so I think it's serving multiple different purposes. One is to mock Herod. Another is to suggest that this is something that the universe itself cannot keep secret. It's revealing that this is this big event that is going to happen. But then it also serves other parts of the narrative, because they then go and they offer gifts as a way to show these non-Jewish wise folks who are, well known as the wisest diviners and astrologers of the day, are coming and bowing down and doing obeisance before this baby, this Jewish baby, as a way to show his sovereignty extends to all the other nations of the earth as well. And then they are going to go back to Herod, but they're warned in a dream to go another way to get back home. And then that outrages Herod, who then goes and has all the infants slaughtered, which, by the way, is not supported by any historical data whatsoever. There's absolutely nothing that suggests this actually took place. But they have served their narrative purpose, and so they exit stage left, and then it's down to Joseph and Mary and Jesus to escape Herod's persecutions. So there's a wonderful book published a little over a year ago by a friend of mine named Eric Vanden Eykel called The Magi that tries to explain in an accessible way who they were, where they came from, how the tradition developed over time. So anybody interested in more info, I would say definitely check out Eric's book.
So it's obvious that there are these, and I'm glad you brought up the slaughter of the innocents. Very relieved to hear that there's no historical evidence for it, just as a mother. And so I wonder, are these authors, are they thinking of, okay, 2,000 years in the future, people are going to be reading this as a history, and so we're just going to slip this in? Or to them, was it just, they were creating this sort of mythology, and they knew and recognized it sort of as a mythology? Like, did they lie to us, or was this part of their sort of were they self-aware and thought we would be in on the fact that these are literary devices? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a kind of binary that makes a lot more sense to us today than it would to them anciently, because just historical narrative as a genre anciently, frequently authors manipulated the details because they had specific rhetorical goals. They were trying to achieve certain functions for their text, and they were making certain points. And the point, whatever rhetorical point they were aimed at, that was the priority. And so the details were kind of in service of that point. And if you needed to massage a detail a little bit, you would. There's a scene in Good Will Hunting where Matt Damon's character says, "Yeah, I was on an airplane," and then Robin Williams says, "Have you ever been on an airplane?" And he's like, "It's kind of necessary for the story to work." Like, there are ways that we do it today. My wife and I, we tell the stories about how we met and got engaged and things like that in mainly the same way, but our different perspectives, the context in which we're telling these stories, whether we want this to come across as a funny story or a spiritual story or whatever we're trying to get across, we're going to massage the details a little bit, or at least highlight certain details and push other details to the background. We're going to do what we need to do to get the point across. And that sat a lot closer to the surface in ancient historical narrative. And so here, the goal is to try to make statements about Jesus' identity and mission. And they probably did not think that there was anything underhanded about tweaking these details a little bit, or about making details up. Because if somebody had said to them, "But is it true?" it would have been like, "He's the Messiah. Of course it's true." Because whatever evoked that kind of emotional response to this thing that they believed was true was in service of that truth, and therefore was true. And so that's not going to satisfy an awful lot of people today. These were not malicious people going, "We're going to fool them all." These were people who were trying to tell a story that meant an awful lot to them, but it was still functioning primarily literarily, and only and secondarily mythologically. And it was probably not even a concern for them or a thought how this text would function well after they were gone. And that's something a lot of people who read the Bible or LDS scripture, we tend to think of these people writing these texts not for themselves, not for the people who lived during their day, but for some unknown people thousands of years in the future. And that's just not how people ever wrote texts. You wrote texts to serve somebody's interests in the time period in which you were writing those texts. And any afterlife of that text was secondary or tertiary, or more than likely not even a consideration at all. So they were just telling the story in a way that would increase the probability that their point would be gotten across, and that it would have the effect and the influence that they desired.
So I wanted to ask you, Dan, a little bit about Jesus' childhood. Little is written in the Bible about his childhood. And a famous instance, I guess, when he went to the temple as a younger person. But what would his life have been like growing up in Nazareth at that time?
Nazareth was a very small hamlet, basically, at the time. If you go there today, you've got to take a road over a little saddle by some pretty steep hills that rise up, and then Nazareth is actually occupies kind of a bowl around these mountains. But in the first century CE, it would have been just a handful of acres. It would have covered. In fact, usually if you go into the Church of the Nativity, they would say something like the property of the church is about the same, covers the same geographic space as the hamlet of Nazareth probably did in the first century CE. So small town living. This would have been subsistence living. They are planting things, they are feeding things and breeding things in order to have enough food for them to get by, and hopefully a little bit more. They're right across the mountain. Mountain. If they go up to the edge of the bowl and across to the other side, there's a much larger, much more Greek metropolis over there, and Sepphoris. And so it's possible that they went there for some trading. If they did, they would have had to know some marketplace Greek. So there is a likelihood that Jesus could speak some Greek, could not have been responsible for the lengthy discourses that we find written in Greek in the Gospels. Those are the compositions of the Gospel authors. But Jesus probably would have known a little bit of Greek. I don't know the degree to which he would have been literate. If he had training in Torah, if he had been trained to as a scripture reader, scripture interpreter, he obviously would have been literate. There is an argument for that. There are also arguments against that the representation of Jesus as this as well informed about the scriptures is could also be a literary creation. But was definitely not one of the wise people, one of the philosophers, one of the scribes, one of the scholars of the day. Most people think he became an itinerant apocalyptic preacher, probably based on just kind of the general discourse of the day. Joseph, his father, is described as carpenter is kind of the traditional understanding, but it was more like a craftsperson, and at the time, wood have been a lot more scarce than stone. So some folks think he might have been a stonemason or something like that. We don't really know for sure. That the Gospels might not even be accurate about that. I don't think there's any reason to think that any accounts of his childhood are historical, because nobody had any reason to pay attention, much less write down anything that he did until his ministry began.
So I'm going to jump to sort of a quote Mormon thing, okay? Mm-hmm. Many Latter-day Saints believe Jesus was born on April 6th because of an interpretation, I guess, of an oblique reference in the Doctrine and Covenants and some things some past church leaders have said. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Latter-day Saints celebrate Christmas on the Western world, on December 25th. Do we know anything, and can we know anything about when Jesus might have been born?
Probably not. And for some of the reasons I've already said, if you try to harmonize Matthew and Luke, which I would say is a bit of a no-no, but if you try to harmonize the two of them and try to come up with what time of year Jesus was born, you can't escape having to make some assumptions. There are, it says, and then Zechariah and Elizabeth went home, and then after that, she conceived. Well, how long did that take? It probably wasn't the night they got home, because they probably were pretty tired already. But there are a bunch of assumptions you have to make, and also you have this calendar Zechariah was on. He was in this. It was his turn to be in the temple, and if you look at the traditional calendar and assume that it held a couple of centuries earlier in the first century, then maybe it was in September, maybe it was in April. But again, that's all presupposing a whole stack of things. So I don't think personally we can know for sure. Again, because nobody had any reason to record or remember anything Jesus did until his ministry started. And so the April 6th date, that's the foundation of the LDS Church, 1830, April 6th, and the Revelation says being 1,830 years from, I forget the exact wording, but basically his incarnation, his birth. And if you interpret that to mean exactly 1,830 years, that's 4 years after Herod died, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
That's
we've already talked about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
December 25th is based on early Greco-Roman traditions. There was this tradition that the most important people to world history, the most divine, the most influential people, their deaths, the date of their death corresponded to the date of their birth. And so if you didn't have somebody's date of birth, the next best thing was the date of their death. And then you could say, we'll just align the two, because that's just kind of poetic justice, or poetic symmetry, let's say, that you die on the same day that you're born. With the early Christians, the tradition developed pretty early on that Jesus was conceived on March 25th. This was the Annunciation that we read about in the Gospels, and this was based on the notion that he died on March 25th, which would have been right around the Passover, right around 30 to 33 CE, somewhere around there. And so, if he died on March 25th, let's say he was conceived on March 25th. 9 months later, December 25th. So the earliest account we have of when Jesus was born is this calculation that was made. Hippolytus, I think around 210 CE, is one of the first ones to say this. I think Irenaeus of Lyon also might have mentioned December 25th. But that's basically a calculation based on these traditions about aligning dates of death with dates of birth, or in the case of Jesus, dates of conception. And so they would have also seen significance in the fact that December 25th was the traditionally observed, not actual date of, but the traditionally observed date of the winter solstice within the Roman Empire. At least it would become that later on. We don't know for sure that it was prior to that. But that would have been just like the Magi can see in the stars that Jesus is being born, the sun at its lowest position when it then turns tail and the days get longer, the sun has woken up, the sun has revived, all of that. They would have seen a kind of poetic symmetry there, that the universe is tuned to Jesus's birth. So, and that would then give way to a lot of the conspiracy theories today about Christians choosing December 25th based on the celebration of the winter solstice and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, it's probably these calculations based on Jesus's date of death and proposed date of conception.
Okay, so now that you've just blown a hole in everyone's nativity program, I have to ask, I know you have 3 kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you teach how, when they were little, I don't know how old they are now, but how have you told the story of the nativity to them?
Well, they're 7, 12, and my oldest will be 16 in 4 days. And we have always presented a pretty traditional Christmas celebration. We read the accounts of the Nativity. I've actually done my own translation of the Nativity accounts, as well as a couple of the other Gospels, intended for a 12-year-old reader. So kind of a kid's translation of the New Testament. And so I use that, and we go through, and we know what we're doing is largely performative. But as my oldest daughter would say, it's all about vibes. So we go in knowing that we're going to vibe with this tradition and this ritual aware that this is just these are literary traditions. We don't know for sure when Jesus was born. I don't think we can. But if we're going to celebrate it, we got to pick a date somewhere. And this is the date we've picked, and this is the way we go about it. And we want our girls to know these stories, be familiar with them, and also be aware that they're more traditional than they are historical. And so far we have had no complaints. We have a couple of different nativity sets, and we give them a chance to take turns telling the story and things like that. So it is the academic facet of it is in the background, but it's definitely there.
So you fight the urge while you're reading the Luke story to say, now what this really means is this, and at least when they're little. So
yeah. We just kind of read it and go, this is the tradition, and then as they get older, we tell them it's not, and we were never from the very beginning we were like, oh, Santa, it's a game we play. We never they never believed in Santa. And this is somewhat related to that. We were like, this is something that we do because it makes this time of year feel more special, but probably not connected to actual historical events.
Yeah. Dan, can I ask a more general question for Latter-day Saints? How can they better enhance? What would be your advice to better enhance their understanding and appreciation of the Bible?
I get messages every day from folks who tell me that my work has helped them appreciate the text more and like the text more. And I also get messages every day from folks who tell me my content has helped them leave it behind and not feel bad about that. So my approach is not going to resonate with everybody. But I think you should not be afraid of asking questions of the text. I think you should not be afraid of chasing down the implications of these different things. When we center and give priority to the notions of historicity or inerrancy or univocality, the notion that the text speaks with one single unified voice and from one single unified consistent perspective, if that becomes the priority, then everything else must serve that. And I think that the text can be an endless source of inspiration that can help us, that can help guide and motivate behavior, even if that is with counterexamples, even if the text is an example of what not to do. There are, you go into the Proverbs, and we have that spare the rod. Spare the rod, spoil the child is actually from a poem called Hudibras, but in Proverbs it says, he who spares the rod hates his child. And there are a lot of well-meaning folks who are like, oh, it's actually about a shepherd's staff. It's about gently guiding children. Entirely false. It is a rod of discipline. The text in another chapter says, if you beat your child with the rod, you will not kill them. You will save them from Sheol. And so the text says a lot of awful things. And I think we use that to motivate us to be better than that. And so I think you can critically approach the Bible and still find it inspiring, still find ways to find joy and happiness and to feel closer to Christ. Because I think that if we hold up, no, it's all perfect, that becomes what we chase after, and everything else must serve that ultimate goal. But even if it were all perfect, Jesus would still be distinct from the text, and I would rather serve Jesus than serve the text. And so I think if we can approach the text as it is, rather than as institutions would prefer we treat it, I think we can actually get closer to understanding who Jesus was, and we can find more inspiration for living better and living in ways that align more with the ways that Jesus lived.
Thanks, Dan. One final question.
Yeah.
Thumbs up or thumbs down on The Chosen?
To be honest, I have not watched The Chosen. However, I do have a fan among the main cast. and I have spoken with this actor a few times about the show. I've heard great things about it. It's obviously there are a bunch of things with a show like this. There are a ton of gaps. You have to fill in the gaps. You have no choice but to fill in the gaps. And you're going to do that in whatever way serves the interests of your audience and what you're the message you're trying to get across with the show. So you cannot be entirely accurate with the show. I've heard there are attempts to be accurate. I've seen things where it's like, probably not very accurate. And I've seen ways that they try to craft their characters to resonate with people today. With some of the neurodivergent characters and things like that. And I think that's wonderful. So at some point, I'm going to have to sit down and watch the show, but I have not had a ton of time for watching TV over the last few years. And I think I owe it to my friend as well to watch the show and his performance in it. So I'm going to have to say, thumbs horizontal for the moment, but I've heard great things about it, and I have no reason to doubt those great things.
Thanks for being here. And
Thank you for having me.
Lots of fun. Thanks to Dave Noyce, to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners that they can keep up with all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.